The next topic is cross-linguistics studies. We have discussed the color terms, and the results of color term studies suggest that the presence of a brief verbal expression in a language influences certain cognitive processes. However, to evaluate the notion of linguistic determinism, we need to study the effects of color terms in different languages. So when we are talking about the color terms that are being characterized in different languages, this particular aspect is known as cross-linguistic phenomena, which basically refers to different variations as or pertaining to different languages and different cultures. Now, there are two formal sides of this debate, which is color term debate rather. One is known as universalist and the other one is the relativist. Now, according to the universalist side, the claim is that the biology of all human beings is the same, and the development of color terminology has absolute universal constraint. Then we have the relativist side, which basically takes us to the cross-linguistic phenomena, which means that there is a variation with regard to naming different objects or characterizing different objects or naming colors. Therefore, since they vary language to language, culture to culture, so it requires cross-linguistic understanding. So when we look at this, we find that there are universal constraints on color naming, but at the same time, differences in color naming across languages cause differences in the color perception as well as color cognition processes. Now let's discuss this particular phenomena. The number of color terms in a language varied quite a bit from language to language. There was an underlying order. And what is that underlying order? That is something we will consider. Now, Berlin and Kay have investigated color terms in various languages, and they have found that although the number of color terms in language varied, but there was an underlying order. They found that every language has a small number of basic color terms. These are terms that consist of only one morpheme, for example, blue versus blue-green, and are not contained within another color. For example, crimson is contained within the category of red and are not restricted to a small number of objects. For example, blonde is restricted mainly to hair color. Furthermore, we see each language draws its basic color term from the following list of 11 names, which is white, black, red, yellow, green, blue, brown, purple, pink, orange, and gray. In addition, Berlin and Kay found that these 11 terms formed a hierarchy. Now, some languages such as English use all 11, whereas others use as few as 2. When a language has just 2 terms, it is not a random selection, but always black and white. Sometimes translated as dark and light. It is not a random selection, so that is something which is important. When a language has a third term, it is always red. The entire hierarchy looks like this. Thus, a language with 4 terms has black, white, red, and either yellow or green. A language with 7 terms has all of these plus blue and brown. In general, Berlin and Kay found a remarkable degree of universal structure in color terms. Now, building on the work of Berlin, Hader performed several studies with Dani and New Guinea people whose language consists of only two color terms, one for black and one for white. Roche was particularly interested with Berlin and Kay and referred to as focal colors, the most representative examples of various basic colors, such as the most bluish blue. Roche argued that focal colors are more perceptually salient than non-focal colors, and that this salience in truth influences the codability and memorability of a color. Now, Roche tested Dani and US participants on a task in which they were presented with color chips and later asked to name them. Roche found that although Americans performed better on the whole, both groups' memory for focal color was better than for non-focal colors. Although these results in that study of color terms began as an attempt to demonstrate the validity of Wolff hypothesis, Roche's studies do not support the hypothesis of linguistic relativity. Rather, they turn it on its head. These studies have led some researchers to conclude that there is little support for the Wolff hypothesis. However, others have questioned both Roche's conclusions regarding color cognition as well as the generality of the color domain. And among them we have Lucy and Schroeder, who argue that the focal colors used by Heather were more perceptually discriminable than the non-focal colors. While focality is an intrinsic property of a color, discriminability is relative to the surrounding colors. When they controlled for discriminability, Lucy and Schroeder found no differences between focal and non-focal colors in short-term recognition memory experiment, although they did note difference in long-term recognition. To conclude, on balance, these results suggest that under some circumstances, the manner in which we perceive and remember color is related to the linguistic terms we use to refer to them. And these terms basically vary culture to culture, language to language. Thus, the color domain appears to provide support for the weak version of linguistic relativity.